And there's so much debate around masculinity today, but I think you've put your finger on something really, really important. I wonder if you can comment on it.
Yes, these are many things that I've frankly learned from my dad, who was a wonderful father.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the principles, and some of these things I formulate in my own words, but I learned many years ago that authority flows to those who take responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
and it runs away from those who seek to evade responsibility or who make excuses. So when someone, let's say a young boy, young boys don't like failing. They don't oftentimes their masculinity is still in formation and is sometimes brittle.
Mm-hmm.
So they try to protect that masculinity by shying away from taking the responsibility for something having gone wrong or something like that. And one of the principal responsibilities of parents is to teach their boys to lean into responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So I define masculinity as the glad assumption of sacrificial responsibility. That's what I think it is.
And that was something that was handed to you by your father?
Yes, very much so. My dad was wonderful at took responsibility for us. And rather than that making us saying, oh, well, then never mind, I don't have to do anything. What he was doing was modeling for us how to take responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So when he took, it's not a zero-sum game, in other words.
Right.
When he took responsibility for us, that taught us to take responsibility for ourselves and then downstream for others.
Can you give an example of that just sort of comes to mind of how that showed up? Because I know this is a question that many men are grappling with today. Like, what is masculinity? I was just talking to a friend about this yesterday. Like, is it this set of things? Maybe there's no of course, culture says there is no definition of masculinity. It's all socially constructed. How do you is it about being a father? Well, what about men who can't be fathers? But it seems there's something essential about the assumption of responsibility that is universal, that whether you're a father or not, whether you're a boy or a man, it crosses all the different spectrum of life. So maybe you can put a pin on like when this kind of landed for you.
Sure. It's not, let me insert something very important here. Let's say a man can't be a father for his wife is infertile or something like that.
Right.
That doesn't change the definition at all.
Yes.
Because you can still be an uncle, you can still be an older brother, you can still be an elder in the church. You can fatherhood is broader than mere biological fatherhood.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly gets exhibited there, but any responsible man can grow up into fatherhood by embracing sacrificial responsibility gladly. So that really is important. Another important caveat at the beginning of this is, and this is probably the hardest thing I have, the hardest thing to communicate that I find around this whole thing, and that is the important distinction between responsibility and guilt or fault.
Mm.
All right. So oftentimes you're responsible for something and you're guilty, but they're not synonyms. They're not the same thing at all. Sometimes you can be both, but they're not. And here's an example. Suppose you buy a business, and let's say the accounts payable and accounts receivable turn out not to have been what were represented, right? And let's say it was all technically honest and legal, but you find yourself owing $50K more than you thought you were going to.
Sure.
Okay. So that whole thing wasn't your fault. You're not guilty.
Right.
Whatever irresponsibility led to that business being $50K in arrears, whoever's fault that was, it wasn't yours. But you bought the business. It's now your responsibility.
Yes.
Right. So a dad is responsible for what's going on in his household. And so I learned from my dad. My dad was in Christian ministry, and he took the requirements of 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 very seriously, which says that if a man doesn't know how to manage his own household, then how is he qualified to to manage the church?
Right.
How can he be qualified to lead in the church when he can't even keep his own little rodeo put together, right? And we knew. I'm the oldest of four. We knew growing up, not because we were ever threatened with it or anything like that. We just knew growing up that if any of us walked away from the Lord and became disobedient, hellions, if we veered off, we knew that our dad would step down from the ministry that day.
Sure.
Not because he was guilty of the sins that we were committing, but he took responsibility. He said, "These are my kids. This is my family," and he never went in for, "Don't blame me. I didn't say that," or "Don't blame me."
Right.
He don't blame me. He hasn't had his nap yet.
Yes.
So oftentimes we find ourselves making excuses all the time instead of simply taking responsibility. And then the thing that many people, many men in the manosphere who are reacting to some of the follies of feminism,
Yep.
think that when I'm urging men to take responsibility, they think that I'm joining in the chorus of blaming men.
Right.
No, it's very important to distinguish the two, because going back to the first comment, if you take responsibility, I believe God has built an inexorable law into the world. If you take responsibility, authority flows in your direction. People want to hear what you have to say.